Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of lecture number 2. We were discussing the theocratic government set up in Geneva, Switzerland by John Calvin and how he completely remade that society. And what really sets apart Calvin from the Roman Catholic Church and even Martin Luther was his insistence that God alone, he claimed, determined each person's salvation. He concluded that there was no such thing as free will, that man was in fact predestined for either heaven or hell, that before you were even born, God had long since determined whether or not you would be saved or damned. This is the notion of predestination. And what we're going to see is people are anxious to read the works of Martin Luther. They're very interested to hear about this John Calvin individual because for some people who had already long since witnessed the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, to them this was overdue. A reckoning was overdue with the church, especially regarding the topic of salvation. For Martin Luther's message of sola fide, or salvation by faith alone, people felt like they could now kind of take their own salvation into their own hands for the first time. They can read the Word of God themselves. They don't need someone else to tell them what they must do to achieve salvation. People no longer feel passive or helpless. They can act upon their convictions. But not everyone left the Roman Catholic Church for purely religious reasons, let's be clear. And Luther could not have gotten very far in breaking with the church in Rome if he did not have some heavy hitters in his corner. Several local rulers, for example, in the German provinces decided to help out Luther and protect him from the long arm of the Roman Catholic Church. Why were they willing to shield him? Some were for political reasons. They saw this, for instance, as their opportunity to lash out against the rule of King Charles V, who was King of Spain and director of the Holy Roman Empire. He controlled part of their territory, and they wanted to break away. So Martin Luther's religious revolution was a way for them to begin a political revolution and break away from the Holy Roman Empire. Other leaders who were not part of the Holy Roman Empire, such as King Henry VIII of England, had their own motivations for embracing the writings of some of these Reformation leaders. Henry VIII was his own man. He was not interested in yielding to the authority of any other human, even if that was the Pope or the head of the Roman Catholic Church. And so what we'll see is in 1534, he's going to declare the Act of Supremacy and break away from the Roman Catholic Church and instead establish the Church of England, placing himself at the head of this new Church of England. In the process of breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church, he will also manage to seize control over a lot of that real estate that the Roman Catholic Church had once dominated in his country of England. Henry VIII was interested in all the money that he could make from taking over these former Roman Catholic Church lands. So his dissolution of the monasteries, where he begins a sustained takeover of Roman Catholic Church lands and begins selling them off, this earns him a pretty penny and increases his financial prestige. And then, of course, we must speak of the personal reasons why Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. He wanted a divorce, something that was forbidden within the Roman Catholic Church. He had no male heir from his first marriage, and his current wife, Catherine, was getting a little old. He was getting desperate. He wanted a younger woman to try and sire an heir, a male heir with. When the church refused to grant him a divorce and he breaks away from the church and establishes the Church of England with himself as the head of this church, he grants himself a divorce. Actually, he'll end up granting himself multiple divorces. He will end up with 6 wives, 2 of which he killed to marry another one, and only one sickly son out of all of those unions, Edward VI, and 2 daughters, half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. We'll be speaking of them more as we move forward in this class. So, as the Reformation began to gain steam, how does it all shake out? Well, if you'll take a look at the map that I have here on the slide, you'll notice that while the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, will slowly begin to enlarge its scope of influence within the southern part of England, note that Scotland, for instance, tends to embrace largely Calvinist influence, although Catholicism still remains strong in England over time, as well, certainly, as Ireland. You'll also notice that much of mainland Europe remains Catholic, but there are little pockets of Calvinist belief or Lutheran belief that start to pop up. And then when you get to Scandinavia, that becomes virtually all Lutheran. And there were many effects of this Protestant Reformation, one of the worst being sustained religious warfare, which will kick off between pro-Catholic forces and anti-Catholic forces across the continent. Expulsion, imprisonment, torture, the death penalty, mass executions, and massacres were tools of religious repression applied by both Catholics and Protestants towards each other. In fact, what we're going to end up seeing is the Peace of Augsburg will have to be issued in 1555. This was a desperate attempt to calm down this constant chaos and bloodshed in the German provinces. It allowed German princes and cities to determine whether their subjects would be Lutherans or Catholics, and permitted those who objected to whatever faith their ruler chose for their population, permitted people to immigrate elsewhere. Unfortunately, there's still going to be religious warfare that will continue to crop up across the continent. Each side, after all, believed themselves to be the true Christian church, so the rivalry ended up being deadly and protracted. Another effect of the Protestant Reformation will be the Catholic Church's response, which becomes known as the Counter-Reformation. Basically, the Roman Catholic Church was not going down without a fight. They were not going to simply step aside to allow these new Protestant denominations to proliferate. So we're going to see several reforms, some of them institutional, such as through the Council of Trent, instituting, for instance, a censorship, widespread censorship on a lot of printed materials, books, pamphlets, and the like throughout the continent. As you might expect, the works of Calvin and Luther were now forbidden, placed upon a list of forbidden books. We'll see book burnings in various areas where the Catholic Church is trying to stop the spread of these so-called heretical beliefs. The Church also unleashed a potent weapon in the form of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was an organization within the Roman Catholic Church that was created specifically to hunt down heretics or non-believers. It had existed for centuries prior to this, but did not come into widespread use until the Protestant Reformation of the 1520s. But even then, the Inquisition only really had a free hand to operate in portions of Spain and to a lesser extent in Italy. Many rulers were afraid, frankly, of this secretive church organization, mainly because of the tortures, quite literally, that were happening behind closed doors at the hands of this church organization. And basically it went like this: anyone accused by the Inquisition of heresy or working against the Roman Catholic Church was put on trial. Only they were assumed to be guilty from the start. You had to prove your innocence in this case. And then they were to be killed, or at the very least you could lose all your property to the church. As a result, the accused were typically tortured, as were witnesses, to extract confessions of guilt. Acid might be poured on victims' hands or other body parts. They might be immersed into pots of boiling oil or water. All the while, a clerk was set to write down their confessions or anything that they said. And even in the case of a victim confessing to things that they never did, more torture typically followed. By the way, not only were Protestant believers caught up in this dragnet by the Roman Catholic Church, but Jewish and Muslim communities also suffered horribly at the hands of the Inquisition. In this increasingly vicious atmosphere of religious torture and violence, the 30 Years' War erupted. And here's where we see the intersection of religion and politics again. The religious basis of this ongoing warfare throughout the continent was clearly the continuing hostilities between Protestant believers and Catholic believers. Even though the Peace of Augsburg had been issued in 1555, it only temporarily quieted down these tensions. Religious tensions were especially fierce in the country of France, which had a sizable Protestant component known as Huguenots. These Huguenots were often targeted for violence by the Catholic majority. On a single day, August 24th, 1572, for instance, Catholic mobs in the city of Paris massacred some 3,000 Huguenots, with thousands more dying in rural areas in a particularly nasty wave of religious-inspired violence. In fact, what we will see is the discrimination against these Protestant believers, these French Huguenots. Some of them will leave the country once and for all, seeking any port in a storm, anywhere to escape this religious persecution. Some will even come to the Americas as a result. The political component of the 30 Years' War is once more we have German ruling families such as the Habsburgs that are fighting against the Holy Roman Empire. We have German territories that are fighting against the Swedish crown. It's complicated, and this isn't a class in just European history, so we have to skim over some of the details. But let's just say that not everyone played by the rules of always favoring one religion or the other. For example, Catholic France during the 30 Years' War allied with the Protestant King of Sweden to take on fellow Catholic rule in Spain under the Habsburgs. So actually we have a series of shifting alliances and not always along strictly religious lines. That's why I say you see an intersection of religion and politics at work during this long and deadly conflict. The upshot of the 30 Years' War: many people now dead. An estimated 15 to 30% of the population in the German territories perished from violence, from famine, from displacement, disease, many things that are associated with ongoing warfare. The document that will finally bring an end to the 30 Years' War will be the Peace of Westphalia, issued in 1648. What this document will do is once and for all allow for permanent religious freedom for citizens in the German states. No longer will rulers be imposing their faith on their subject populations, but each person will get to choose their particular religion and feel free to practice it without fear of reprisal.